these Chapter 3 videos, we are going to take a look at cells. So, to review, cells are the basic structure, or the basic units of structure and function of living things. And so they're the smallest units that can carry out life processes. All organisms are made up of one or more cells, and all of these cells have many of the same structures. This allows them to carry out some of the same basic processes. So, a little history. When we look at the discovery of cells, we have to talk about a British scientist by the name of Robert Hooke. So back in the 1665, the microscopes weren't of very good quality. However, he was able to look through the microscope at a thin slice of cork, which comes from trees, a cork tree. And he saw this honeycomb-like structure, and each of the little openings that he saw, he called cells. So this was the first time that cells really got a name. Moving on through time, then we have Anton van Leeuwenhoek. He made his own microscope lenses. And so this allowed him to create a stronger, more powerful microscope. And they were almost as strong and powerful as our modern microscopes today. And he discovered tiny animals in pond water that we now know are called diatoms. And the diatoms he found swimming in the water from a pond that he collected a sample from. And here's an example of a diatom. It's a microscopic organism. And so he also looked at human blood cells. And his last kind of claim to fame here is he scraped the plaque from his teeth and discovered bacteria. And he actually called bacteria animalcules. So in the early 1800s, a lot of research had been done by this point, and cells of many different organisms had been discovered. So Theodor Schwann and Matthias Jacob Schleiden proposed that cells are the basic building blocks of all living things. In the 1850s, Rudolf Virchow observed cells dividing and forming new cells. And so he proposed that living cells come from other living cells. So scientists put together this cell theory, and the cell theory has 3 parts. The first part says that organisms are made up of one or more cells. The second is that all the life functions of an organism occur within a cell. And then lastly, all cells come from other cells. So, in the late 1800s, microscopes had pretty much reached their upper limits. They were as good as they were going to get. And so, objects smaller than cells were too small to be seen with a regular microscope. So, in the 1950s was when the electron microscope finally got invented. And so this uses a beam of electrons instead of light, and this allowed scientists to see tiny structures inside cells, and it even allows scientists to see atoms and molecules. This led to the beginning of a field of biology called molecular biology. So, all living cells have certain things in common. They obtain and use energy, they respond to their environment, and they can reproduce. Different types of cells within the same organism will have unique functions, and they will also generally have different functions. and their shape will match the function of their cells. So when we look at cell size, cells have to be able to move substances into and out of the cell very quickly. So we want nutrients and oxygens to come into the cell very quickly and waste products to leave. So cells with larger volumes are going to need more nutrients, and then they're also going to produce more waste. So remember, here would be an example of a cell with a large volume. It looks like 27 centimeters cubed, opposed to this blue cube where the volume is only 1 centimeter cubed. The larger the cell is, the smaller its ratio of surface area to volume is. This means it's harder to get rid of waste and take in nutrients. So we need a bigger ratio of surface area to volume in order to effectively and efficiently move substances into and out of the cell. So cell shape will match the function of the cell. So the shape will help the cells do its job. So for example, here if you look at the nerve cells, you'll notice that they've got the spindly fingers on them, and their job is to send messages to other parts of the cell. So those long fingery extensions help them reach out in all directions and allows the messages to pass to many cells at one time. Algae have the tail-like projections, and this helps them swim. And if you look at the pollen grains have those spikes on them, which helps them to stick to insects to allow them to more easily and efficiently be pollinated. All cells have certain structures in common, including the plasma membrane, the cytoplasm, the cytosol, ribosomes, and some type of nucleic acid. So the plasma membrane, also called the cell membrane, is a thin coat of lipids that surrounds the cell. This forms a physical boundary between the cell and its environment. The cytoplasm includes all the cellular material inside the cell. It's all the stuff that a cell has. This includes the cytosol, which is a watery substance that makes up the cytoplasm. Ribosomes are structures in the cytoplasm where proteins are made. And then lastly, all cells have some type of nucleic acid. Most often it will be DNA, is the nucleic acid. And this contains the genetic instructions that cells need to make proteins. There are two types of cells based on the nucleus. The nucleus is the organelle inside eukaryotic cells that contain most of the cell's DNA and act as the control center of the cell. So the presence of the nucleus is what will determine if a cell is prokaryote or eukaryote. Prokaryotic cells are cells that lack a nucleus, and the DNA is just floating in the cytoplasm. These are generally single-celled organisms like bacteria. Prokaryotes then are organisms with prokaryotic cells, and these were the first type of organisms to evolve on Earth. They are also the most common organisms on Earth still today. Eukaryotic cells are cells with a nucleus. Usually, these cells are larger than prokaryotic cells, and they're mainly found in multicellular organisms. Eukaryotes then are organisms with eukaryotic cells. This can range from fungus to people to plants to animals. There's a wide variety. Eukaryotes also have organelles. Organelles are structures within the cytoplasm that perform a specific job. much like our organs, like our heart, has a specific job. This allows eukaryotic cells to carry out more functions than prokaryotic cells. So a couple examples of organelles. One is the mitochondria. And these mitochondria's job is to provide energy to the cell. And then vacuoles, another organelle, are storage centers within the cell. And so here is a picture of your eukaryotic cell, much more complex than the prokaryotes. You'll notice all of these off to the side here. These are all different organelles found within eukaryotic cells. So viruses are tiny particles that can cause disease. So for example, the virus that causes the common cold or flu, they're not really cells. Even though they contain DNA, they lack other parts shared by all cells. They don't have a plasma membrane, they don't have a cytoplasm, and they don't have ribosomes. So scientists question whether they are living. And so in order to be living, an organism needs to be made up of cells. And viruses are not made up of cells. And they also cannot reproduce on their own. They require a host in order to reproduce. So the majority of the scientific community do not consider viruses as prokaryotes, eukaryotes, or even living.